Hey there, FakeFox here. Welcome to a Healer's Guide to Scrivener's Hall. Scrivener's Hall is one of the two new 4-player dungeons from the Scribes of Fate DLC, and in this video I will explain everything you need to know to successfully heal it. This guide is based on the hard mode difficulty, but of course also works for veteran and normal. Everything will just hit less hard and some mechanics will be missing. Throughout this guide, I will be giving set and ability recommendations. These are not meant as a complete build, but as ideas on how you can alter your existing build to better suit the encounters. If you are interested in the build I am using in the background footage, it is linked in the description. These recommendations also assume that you are using Spellpower Cure or your DDs were Sea Serpent Coil, so I will not be mentioning that for every boss, but you definitely want to have Major Courage. Let's get started with the trash encounters up to the first boss. These are not particularly challenging, and dangerous mechanics only happen if larger enemies such as the bears or Atronarchs stay alive for a while. You can play with a damage focused build to get through these fights quicker, as there is not a lot of healing required. I recommend using your ultimate on the third group if at all, as this is the most dangerous one, or I guess the only dangerous one, and then you get it ready for the first boss again if you have decent ultimate generation. The larger enemies apply debuffs to the tank that increase damage taken and reduce healing received. There is a good chance that you can completely ignore that, as the tank should not take a lot of damage anyway, but be aware that it will be more difficult to heal the tank back up should they drop. The only really dangerous mechanic for you and the damage dealers comes from the Storm Atronarchs. If these stay alive for too long, they charge up a big AoE dealing pretty high damage. You can simply run out of it or alternatively just block it. After that, you face the first boss, Riftmaster Naqri. This boss has another difficulty modifier additional to the hard mode banner. There is a purple glowing book on a table. Burning it increases the damage the boss does and grants you an achievement. Doing this is not required for the trifecta achievement. The central mechanic of this encounter is the codices. The boss summons a floating book at the center of the arena at 85, 55 and 35% health. While a codex is active, all players take constant moderate damage and an illusion regularly spawns next to each player that is only visible to that player. Depending on the color of the codex, these do one of three mechanics. White has to be blocked, red has to be interrupted, and green has to be dodged. If you fail this mechanic, you take quite a bit of damage and are knocked back. Not deadly on its own, but you still shouldn't ignore it. The codex mechanic can and should be stopped by finding two glowing books in the bookshelves around the arena. The location of these books is indicated by projectiles coming out of the codex. Finding the books is usually done by the damage dealers. They will take constant damage until they found both books. Buff them with HOTS before they leave, as they will be out of healing range or out of line of sight for at least a few seconds. When the damage dealers come back, also make sure to heal them up quickly, as getting close to the boss at low health is very risky. The reason for that is a whirlwind of small AoEs that are surrounding the boss for large portions of the fight. These deal moderate damage, but players can drop very quickly and even be one-shot when being hit by multiple at once. The AoEs can also be blocked and even jumped over, but as a healer you can just stand far enough back. And the third and last important mechanic is incendiary literature. Past 70% health, the boss will regularly teleport and spawn a green circle or two in hard mode next to his new location. A player has to stand in each circle and block the explosion that happens after a few seconds. Otherwise, the entire group takes very high oblivion damage that can easily be deadly. Without hard mode, this can be done by the tank alone, but with hard mode, you should be blocking the second circle, as the damage dealers might not be there at the time because of the codex mechanic. In terms of build, you can heal this boss as an off-healer, but it's relatively stressful and I wouldn't really recommend it. Due to the codex mechanic, the fight is split up in 3 to 4 distinct damage phases. Burst damage support sets like Master Architect or Sexial Champion work particularly well, but ultimate generation sets such as Pillager's Prophet or Akarsa's Genius are also pretty good options. You can build your ultimate up with Pearls of Valinna while the DDs are searching for the books to then enable maximum burst damage once they are back. Sticky Hots, particularly Echoing Vigor and Radiating Regeneration, are very helpful to get healing onto the damage dealers when they are outside of the main arena. Additional Ground Hots make it easier to out-heal the constant incoming damage while the group is together, but it's not essential. For burst healing, it is absolutely enough to have Comet Prayer. Now to the trash between the first and second boss. You will encounter a few groups of the same enemies you already faced before the first boss. After you enter a portal into the Deadlands, you will start facing groups of Dremora with additional larger enemies. None of them are particularly dangerous, but overlapping AoE mechanics can cause relatively high incoming damage at times. The Havokrell charge at a player as soon as they are pulled and knock everyone back. This can be dodged, but the timing has to be very precise. Place your hots before the pull so the group still has healing if you are knocked back. This is also the first time you can hunt a Cartoclapt, which is part of the secret mechanic of this dungeon. There are green glowing tunnels at the sides of the main path, and there is a scamp in one of those. The scamp does not fight you, but runs away when you attack it. If you kill it, you get a key with which you can open chests, dropping set pieces after you beat the final boss, and also summon a secret boss. If you're not fast enough, it teleports to another location, but it does not reset its health, so you can just kill it there. You can go for damage yourself, or at least maximize your offensive support here. Okay, time for the second boss, Ozezan the Inferno. First of all, the boss disappears into the ground and changes position quite frequently. This leaves behind a big fire AoE. You have to get out of it before it appears fully, as the initial explosion can be deadly. If the boss comes back up in the middle of the arena, it channels a firestorm and pulls players inwards. Get close to a wall outside of the AoE marker, otherwise this is a one-shot on higher difficulties. If the boss reappears on the edge of the arena instead, it channels beams that follow each player. These beams deal a lot of damage and slow you, so try not to get hit, and also don't run your beam into other players either. As a third mechanic, the boss shoots projectiles at all players. These absorb healing, and if you're hit too often, apply a dot called Blood Boil. I recommend dodging 2 times during this mechanic to avoid most of it. The final mechanic we cover in detail here dictates how you approach the fight. Ozezan spawns Broodlings, small green insects. If you run over them, they die and you get a speed buff, which by the way is very helpful for the beam mechanic. After a while, evolved Broodlings adds with a relatively nasty channeled attack, shooting projectiles at everyone will spawn, based on how many Broodlings are left. In hard mode this can be up to 5. You can approach this mechanic and with it the whole encounter in 2 ways. Either you get rid of the Broodlings or you ignore this mechanic. Pull the evolved Broodlings to the boss and just let them die in cleave damage. The second approach is quicker and also kind of simpler, but especially demanding for the tank and healer, as the already high incoming damage of this fight gets increased even more, so I would advise against ignoring Broodlings unless the tank can handle pulling in the additional enemies, and the group has enough damage to burn everything down in AoE relatively quickly. Like I already said, this fight has a very high incoming damage, which gets significantly worse with overlapping mechanics, so avoiding what you can is really important. And the rest comes down to good positioning and just raw healing power. The tank will take a lot of damage from the boss, especially from Wild Secretion, a Conal AoE, and Blood Boil if it isn't dodged. As the boss is large, it is best for the damage dealers to stand on one side instead of directly behind it, so they are closer to the tank and it is significantly easier to heal and support everyone. Layering AoE hots is tremendously effective here, but I would also advise taking Radiating Regeneration to cover the movement phases. For burst healing, Combat Prayer is ideal here, and additional burst heals should not be necessary. This fight is mostly about sustained damage. Master Architect is nevertheless a great choice, as it's simply a stupidly strong set. Catalyst is probably the most ideal here if you can run it, and Ultigen sets can also work well, especially if you want to play it safe to have more barriers for overlapping mechanics. Purse of Elnathay make a lot of sense, as you will mostly just stand around and spam healing, but don't risk it too much. If you run dry here, it's really difficult to recover. The trash from second to final boss is mostly Mephala themed. In these groups, the smaller Daedra and spiders don't really do anything, only the Fleshatronarchs and bigger spiders are somewhat dangerous. Once again, the tank gets debuffed quite a lot. The Fleshatronarchs have a frontal cleave that can be deadly if turned into the group. Inside Mephala's realm, you can also find another scamp, this time in the side corridors that are blocked by webs you have to burn first. And with that, we are at the final boss, or rather the two final bosses, Valinna and Lamikhai. This encounter features 3 separate arenas. In the first one, you fight Lamikhai, a giant spider, to 50% of its health. Then in the second arena, you first fight Valinna, a mage, to 50% of her health, and then kill Lamikhai. In the final arena, you then finish off Valinna. In the first arena, you only have to deal with a fire rain. Players get markers over their heads, and after a few seconds, a fire rain AoE spawns in their position that stays permanently active. The solution is to drop these off at the edge of the arena. You can also stack them to save space. If you track your debuffs, you see a timer on when the AoE spawns. Meanwhile, the boss enrages from time to time, and the tank has to pull it across the room into an ice circle to freeze it. If both mechanics are played correctly, there is essentially no incoming damage in this phase. Once Lamikhai is at 50% health, it disappears and fire fills the arena. You quickly have to run through the now open corridor to the second arena, where you start the first phase of Valinna. While she is active, you once again have to deal with the fire rain, but now with additional mechanics, and they can even overlap. Immolation Trap spawns a circle around one player except the tank, and in hard mode on 3 players. If someone crosses the circle, the trap explodes, and this can easily wipe you. The DDs and the healer can stack with the traps, which gives the tank more space and makes it kind of easier to heal. However, there is also Ignite, and this mechanic is really nasty. It's an 8-second dot on every player that has 2 components. One only ticks on that player and isn't too bad. The other one is an AoE around each player that hits really hard, especially if you stack it. So split up if possible. If you are stacking for the trap, be prepared for an extremely hard healing check when the 2 mechanics overlap. Keep your HUDs active and be ready to spam combat prayer. And the last mechanic you need to be aware of is a fire cone on the tank. It deals quite a bit of damage over a few seconds and places AoEs under the tank as well, so they have to move around quite a bit. Especially if this mechanic overlaps with Ignite, you might need to heal the tank quite heavily. Also, about 90% of the time, the mechanics happen in the exact same order, but there is a chance that they don't, so be prepared for that. When you have Valinna down to 50%, she teleports away and Lamikhai comes back. In this phase, you have to deal with the traps, but no fire rain or ignite. So in this phase, absolutely do stack the traps, because similar to the first arena, the tank has to pull the boss across the room to freeze it. The boss has a massive hitbox that can push you out of the trap, exploding it, so be careful with that. The new mechanic in this phase is a larger spider that spawns regularly on the left or right side of the arena. It pulls the furthest away player, except the tank, towards itself and deals high, potentially deadly damage once the player is pulled in completely. It should be killed quickly before that happens. You can make sure to be as far away from it as possible, so you get pulled and the DDs have more time to kill it. How fast you're pulled is, by the way, based on your movement speed, so if you are slower, you actually have more time for the mechanic. If you're attempting a no-death or trifecta run, You can use barrier when the spider spawns so no one dies should you fail to kill it. Not placing the fire rain on the spawning positions of the spider in the previous phase also helps. Otherwise, this phase is relatively relaxing to heal. But that changes quite drastically once you defeat Lamikhai. This time the way to the next arena is a narrow and uneven bridge you can actually fall off from. In the final arena you will once again face Valinna with all her previous mechanics, Fire Rain, Traps, Ignite and the Fire Cone. Additionally, in the hard mode, boulders roll through the arena all the time, which knock you back and potentially off the edge. These display an AoE marker before they start to move, but it then disappears, which can be really confusing, but they can be blocked. And there's also a meteor that spawns regularly and explodes after a while, knocking you off as well. You can kill the meteor, but I would actually not recommend that. It deals little damage and you can block it. Ignoring it makes the fight quicker and it's easier to keep the group together. And that is really the main difficulty of the final phase. The damage dealing mechanics are the same you already successfully healed in the second arena, so they shouldn't be that problematic, but the additional mechanics make it difficult to position correctly and apply effective healing. We found that the best approach is to not chase the boss around. When she teleports away, simply stay where you are and let her come back to the tank. Using an off-healing build for this encounter can be quite effective, as there are long phases that require almost no healing and allow you to deal considerable damage. However, I would strongly advise against it unless your group is experienced with the fight and knows how to avoid unnecessary damage. The final phase in particular can require a high healing output over longer periods of time, which is difficult to sustain on an off-healer build. For the skills, I recommend bringing Radiating Regeneration, should the group split up too much in the third arena, otherwise 1 or 2 ground hots should do the job. Having a single target burst heal like Breath of Life or Healthy Offering might be good for the final phase if the group is not experienced, otherwise Combat Prayer should be enough. In terms of sets, essentially any good support set can work well here. You can go for high burst damage with Master Architect to shorten the Valinna phases in particular and get less of her overlapping mechanics, but more sustained damage or Ultimate Generation also works really well. You could even play defensive sets as there is no time pressure, but I would still not recommend it as there is also not really constant incoming damage, and the danger comes more from one-shot mechanics, so the best defense is certainly well-timed barriers. For a full healing build, I absolutely recommend going for Pearls of Elnofey for this boss as well, since even if you don't risk it in the more intense phases, you can still generate tons of ultimate while Lamikhai is active, and you essentially have nothing better to do anyway. For the last section of this video, I will now talk about the secret chests and boss. When you take the portal back to the entrance after defeating Valinna and Lamikhai, you can run back into the dungeon where an NPC unlocks a previously inaccessible room to you. In this room you'll find 40 chests, 20 small and 20 large. These are unlocked with the keys you get from hunting scams. Keys from normal difficulty unlock small chests, keys from veteran, large chests. Only the player unlocking them can actually loot the chests. If the group opens all chests of one type, a boss spawns in the middle of the room, the Cardo Queen. This boss is relatively easy, so I don't have any special recommendations here, just run your setup from the final boss for convenience. She teleports around, places stone pillars to block you, and has a few AoEs that aren't particularly dangerous, but you shouldn't stand in them of course. Defeating her gives you an achievement and a treasure map. This map also has a chance of dropping from the chests, but from the boss it is guaranteed. From digging up this treasure, you get a tool to locate cartoclepts, making it easier to farm them for keys. Subsequent defeats of the Cardo Queen still give you a set piece, but that's essentially it. Farming the chests can make sense though, to get set pieces in specific traits. They aren't curated though, similar to the regular chests. And with that, we are at the end of this guide. If you have any additional questions, please ask them in the comments. Thanks for watching and bye.